I'm so excited to be here with Lisa and Lauren. I love this book so much, and this topic is very near and dear to my heart because I discovered in the last couple of years, I have a 13-year-old, I discovered that our school's approach to teaching sex ed is to just not teach it. they just haven't gotten it, and so I've actually been working with our school to try to get at least like the reproductive system covered. So we're doing that, and I'm hoping that we're going to learn a lot tonight about the history of sex ed, how we got here, what it can look like in the future. And so Lisa and Lauren, I know you guys want to read some excerpts from the book, so why don't we start there?
Okay, so we're going to start with the history part. And what this section of the book at the very beginning really asks you to do is to imagine what it's like if there isn't sex ed, and in fact, you just don't know about sex and you are 25. Okay, like I want you to really process that possibility because that's actually what I'm going to be describing. So this starts in the Progressive Era and Gilded Age, which I've already lost you because people assume that means it's boring, but I will try and continue and persuade you otherwise. Okay, consider the amazement of historian Carl Degler when he came across the research notes of Dr. Kalia Mdul-Mosher, a Stanford faculty member who left in her records a set of unpublished interviews with 45 married women, most of whom had been born before 1870. They had come of age during a time when dresses were long, divorce was difficult to obtain, and contraception was illegal. Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, published in 1900, was censored. It's a banned book, like behind me, for depicting an unrepentant woman who has premarital sex. Yet not only did Mosher's survey takers, who I think of as the Mosher wives, bluntly answer Dr. Mosher's questions about their sexual histories and ideals, but their answers overturned scholars' pre-existing assumption that this generation of middle-class women had been sexually repressed. It turns out that many women understood sex as not only the basis for reproduction, but as a source of pleasure. And this gets better because we're pretty sure they're Stanford faculty wives. So that makes it extra good. Okay, so the revelation about sexual pleasure strikes most historians as the most important finding. But for me, in the midst of writing a history of sex education, it was another pattern that stood out. Many of the Mosher wives confessed to very limited knowledge about sex before their weddings. The Mosher survey therefore provoked a question that most modern Americans would never think to ask, because to us the answer seems so intuitive. Should women know about sex before having it? For adult women to remain ignorant of sex, there are a lot of things that would have to be true. Books, for one, would need to be restricted in some way. To investigate, I followed up on the comments from one Cornell graduate. Okay, again, she graduated from Cornell, okay, who described her premarital education as very slight and indefinite, okay, despite having read parts of Talkology, a manual delivering information about childbirth and child raising. Now, having myself read Talkology, an enormously popular volume first published in 1886 and then continually until its author's 1912 desk and on the bookshelf next to me in case you want to see it later. Okay? I can confirm that it's possible to read the entire book and not emerge any the wiser about human sexuality. Consider this the only explicit description of heterosexual copulation in the 400-page book. Conception or impregnation takes place by the union of the male sperm and the female germ. Okay, another description from a marriage and sexuality manual appears below, simply because I want to convey how much this genre of writing was, to moderns like us, hilariously uninformative. One tactic was to use technical language that obscured as much as it enlightened, and then to compound the problem with circular references in which unexplained terms were defined via other unexplained terms. Consider this passage penned by John Harvey Kellogg, who's the brother of Kellogg's cereal guy. Just throwing that out. The act of union, or sexual congress, is called coitus or copulation. It is accompanied by a peculiar nervous spasm due to excitement of the special nerves, principally located in the, it's italicized, of the male. And in an extremely sensitive organ, the, also italicized, clitoris in the female. The nervous action referred to is one more exhausting to the system than any other to which it is subject. The passage was, it should be noted, unillustrated, as well as unilluminating. It is exemplary of a trend that Dr. Margaret A. Cleves described in 1906 as one where, this is the quote, the simplest physiological facts are imparted in such a manner that the child is left to puzzle over the meaning of the words and to associate a term with the thought that it is not something that they are intended to understand. Alternatively, there was also the option of complete silence. What a young woman ought to know, which I also have on the shelf over here, from 1898, said exactly nothing about copulation, although the author, Dr. Mary Wood Allen, did provide an ideal schedule for bowel movements, a lecture on avoiding restrictive clothing, and a summary of best etiquette for the engaged. Anyone who might then look to what a young wife ought to know, and that chapter called Marital Relations, for enlightenment would, I assure you, also remain completely ignorant of what marital relations actually meant. The spate of the new sex and reproduction manuals whose popularity rose in the mid to late 19th century did not, it would appear, enlighten everyone. It was possible for a woman who held a bachelor's degree from Syracuse University to describe her premarital knowledge as none to speak of, nothing at all definite in my mind, despite having read Miss Shepherd's talks with girls. She was, quote, so innocent of the matter that until I was 18, I did not know the origin of babies, and her knowledge did not substantially increase until after marriage. Likewise, a Pacific University alumna had known not the least in the world. That's the quote. I'm always like, that has to have been said with like nothing, with vacant eyes. Okay, Carl Degler would point out in his summary of the survey results that almost half of the surveyed women claimed to have no premarital knowledge at all, with many others describing their knowledge as minimal. What would eventually disrupt such ignorance is the story of sex education.
Should I go right into my
Yes.
section? Okay.
Now the philosophy.
Not heavy philosophy, don't worry. Oh, this is okay, can you hear me? So part of my purpose in this chapter is to show that even though we are at each other's throats over sex education, and it seems like the most controversial issue at times, compared to this idea that 100 years ago, women didn't need to know what sex was, we've actually got a huge amount of consensus now. It's just masked by the way we talk about things. So I'm going to read a little section here called What Are We Arguing About? At least two kinds of disagreement about sex education should be distinguished. Disagreement about means and disagreement about ends. Ends are value-laden goals that structure the pursuit of activities. Means are choices about how to achieve the ends. While it may seem as though various camps in the sex education debates have incommensurable values, there's more agreement at the level of ends than at the level of means. For example, it's usually taken for granted that we do not want adolescents to become pregnant or contract sexually transmitted infections. Regardless of one's political views, these aims are nearly universal, and sex education in all its guises has been deployed to achieve them. In every era, people have been spurred to action by high rates of so-called bastard babies and syphilitic adolescents. Today, everyone on the sex ed stage, from Planned Parenthood to the Heritage Foundation, prioritizes these unquestioned aims. They agree so much, you might say they're awkward bedfellows. Progressives and conservatives even agree to a surprising extent that abstinence is the ideal for youth, or at least that sexual activity should be delayed and promiscuity should be minimized. There is some scientific rationale for all of this, but on some level, adults, and especially parents, are probably apt to feel anxious by the thought of school-age kids having a lot of sex, whatever their own political proclivities. Less sexual activity among young people is, rightly or wrongly, a baseline aim that enjoys broad support. It's worth taking a brief look at the treatment of abstinence in various sex education curricula to drive this point home. Opponents of comprehensive sex education, henceforth CSE, appear to have cornered the market on preaching youth abstinence, often portraying advocates of more extensive sex education as amoral libertines who encourage young people to experiment sexually early and often. This depiction is demonstrably off base. Here's the Centers for Disease Control talking about why sexuality education is important. Quote, "It can help young people delay sexual initiation until they are ready. Comprehensive sexual health education teaches abstinence as the only 100% effective method of preventing HIV, STIs, and unintended pregnancy." Even Planned Parenthood, a favorite target of social conservatives, measures the effectiveness of sex education against the goal of delaying sexual activity, along with, quote, "reducing the frequency of sex," and, quote, "reducing the number of sexual partners." Its website has a whole page devoted to the benefits of abstinence. It even measures the success of its own initiatives, such as the Get Real program, against the benchmark of delaying and reducing teen sexual activity. So much for sexual libertinism. The 2015 Ontario curriculum that's where I live, how I got involved in this, that garnered considerable pushback, was also accused of promoting promiscuity, despite identifying delaying sexual activity as the #1 learning objective. In a contentious section about sexual decision-making, students were expected to, quote, "explain the importance of having a shared understanding with a partner about the following: delaying sexual activity until they are older, choosing to abstain from any genital contact, choosing to abstain from having," you can probably fill in the rest of the sentence, "vaginal or intercourse, choosing to abstain from having oral genital contact, and the reasons for not engaging in sexual activity." Okay, this is in like a cutting edge comprehensive curriculum that garnered massive backlash. These are awfully indirect ways of encouraging promiscuity. In short, abstinence only teaches abstinence as an end very conspicuously, but anti-abstinence only programs offer different means toward the same goal. So while there are some ends on which we see genuine disagreement, much of the disagreement among opponents of sex education has nothing to do with aims. This suggests that what opponents are often disagreeing about is how we ought to go about accomplishing these widely endorsed goals. This might be akin to observing that different political parties all endorse the aim of having a strong economy, but disagree about whether they should strive for it by reducing taxes or investing in infrastructure. The means in question here are choices about educational policy and pedagogical practice. Indeed, we now have substantial evidence about the correlation between different educational means and the sexual health outcomes to which they are ostensibly oriented. Counterintuitive though it may seem, if the goal is to keep kids abstinent for longer, preaching abstinence as the exclusive form of sex education is a disastrous strategy. After about 40 years of aggressive abstinence-only education in the United States, 77% of people had had sex by age 20, 97% of sexually experienced Americans had had sex before marriage, and the teen pregnancy rate was among the highest in the developing world. In Switzerland, the teen pregnancy rate is 1/7 of the American rate, and the teen birth rate is 1/15. Since the United States claims it would like numbers closer to the Swiss ones, something has obviously gone wrong. The educational means, curriculum, and policy choices are not accurately calibrated to the supposed aims, what we say we want to accomplish. So I'll pause there, but that's my introduction to trying to figure out, so why do we keep going about this the wrong way, and why do people think they're disagreeing when they're not?
Thank you. So, Lisa, I'm going to start with you. You have this lovely pile of strange books back here that you found on eBay. And I know you dug up lots of weird factoids about like how sex ed has been taught In America, you told us about some of it in your introduction, but the history of sex ed is full of misogyny, racism, double standards, and some of the approaches are just plain weird. So can you list some of the weirdest and most misguided stuff that you dug up?
The weirdest stuff. Okay. So I mean, this is going to be kind of counterintuitive, but this is actually my husband's favorite example. Okay, so this is the weirdest one I've heard. So in the early 1970s in New York City, they had no sex education basically in the schools. It was totally decentralized. There was no plan, right? And so the Ford Foundation gets involved and gives, I'm not making this up, in modern dollars, $1.75 million to teenagers to just run their own program. And I just think about that and I'm like, okay, part of me is kind of like, yeah, empower the youth, but $1.75 million? Are you kidding me? So that's an example of like some of the weirdness, right, that takes place. I do talk a lot in the book about peer education, which if you think about it, it's really interesting because we keep turning to that for health, drug education, and sex education, and that nobody's using it for math. Right? And you're like, okay, so either the pedagogy works or it doesn't, and we should probably figure out which one it is. So there's that kind of unevenness. I personally have a great fondness for kind of mid-century sex education because I think that the attention to trying to make sure that young people don't feel bad about their bodies as they go through puberty is actually quite touching and lovely, and then it just goes off the rail, right? Where you're just like, and oh, we're just assuming everyone's getting married and they're all heterosexual. Okay, I got that now. And also, oh, if you marry someone of a different race, you're bound to fail, and also never somebody from another religion. Got it, okay. So it's one of those things where I think each era of sex education has things about it that are really wonderful and interesting, and people are really trying. And then it also has things where you're like, well, that was a whiff. It just doesn't make any sense.
Can you talk about where the birds and the bees, the phrase the birds and the bees comes from?
Oh yeah, so birds and the bees actually has a logic to it. Okay, if you think about it, sex education is different than any other form of education because how do you know if it worked? Okay, you can't ask them to demonstrate that they know it works, right? There's no experiential learning component. That in fact means you failed, right? Okay, so it comes of age in this time in which like pedagogically trying to use object learning, where you looked at things, you thought about things, that's really the way it's supposed to go. But nobody thinks that people should get naked in class. Nobody wants to do participant observation. You want to know if it worked. I mean, you need to follow around teenagers for several years. That's a horrible idea. The ethics of assessing whether or not it worked are really a problem. So early in the 20th century, the birds and the bees is this idea of nature study, which is that what you'll do is you'll look at the birds and you'll look at the bees and you'll learn about how they reproduce. And the sex ed that you'll get out of it is fundamentally about caretaking. Did your baby chick die? Right? Maybe you're not ready to be a parent. But it's supposed to be about that kind of close scrutiny of the natural world as providing a foundation for understanding human sexuality, while at the same time practicing the very skills that make you good at human sexuality, right? Nurturing, attention to other people's needs. It sounds really good unless you stop with birds and bees and then just abandon the curriculum, which is sometimes what happens.
I would have at least chosen mammals.
Mammals are a little close to home. So, I mean, the thing is, why wasn't there sex ed in the 19th century? The answer is mammals. If you lived on a farm, right, you needed to know how the cows became cows, and that involved a lot of watching cows, and you were economically invested in that process, so it just wasn't necessary, right? It's as people start to move into cities, and it's really just for very sheltered people, like the ones I was talking about. Yeah.
And what was some of the dating advice that young men and women have been given?
Do you know how long it took me to figure out what petting meant? I mean, just ages. I was going through books, there's a whole conversation about petting and whether or not petting is okay, and everybody uses the term in the mid 20th century. I could not figure it out. Petting means you're lying down. Now it makes sense, right? Grandma suddenly makes sense. So it's so there's little things like that, but a lot of it is really about kind of the ways in which the process of dating should of necessity involve the taking on of gender roles, right? So from mid-century forward, it's that Basically, like, you should be happy being a man, you should be happy being a woman, you should be happy being different, and therefore you can find each other. I mean, it's all working with a very heterosexual lens, like very, very much. But gender roles and heterosexuality are seen as one and the same thing, right? So the whole goal is that you learn to date in order to learn to be gendered. So after they spend all this time teaching men and women that they're totally different from each other, they're like, now let's have a school dance, you know, which is awkward at best, right? So it's kind of this strange thing that you learn that you're so different, right? And then you're smushed together. So like in mid-century, a lot of school activities you can't even attend unless you have a date, right? And that's, you know, kind of crazy to me. Like, you can't go to the football game unless you have a date to go to the football game. Like, what does that have to do with it? It's like, football game, that's really romantic anyway. But those are kind of the requirements that start to come into play. In mid-century, adults, to my mind, get way too invested in young people dating, and they date very young. So they start dating like age 10, like really young. Like, if anybody gives you a bad time about, you know, our generation having been promiscuous, you turn around and you go like, how many people you date before you met dad? You know, my mom's right there, so it's a little awkward. But there is that sense, right? Like, I remember talking to my 8-year-old neighbor who got married in her early 20s, and one day she looks at me and she goes, I dated 43 men. Because it was this idea that dating was something you were supposed to do constantly in an ongoing basis, in a way that, frankly, I just find exhausting and unfathomable as an idea.
So Lauren, you write about how it seems that sex ed is controversial, and it must, like we imagine it must be because there are equal numbers of people who support it and oppose it. You kind of talked about this in what you read. But I'm going to quote from the book. In survey after survey, school-based sex education is more popular than Morgan Freeman, Tom Hanks, or Yoda. So why is it so hard to get why is it so hard to get sex ed in schools, and where is their common ground?
That's a big question. So it's not the case that there are equal numbers of people who support it and oppose it at all. It's the case that some people's views have been disproportionately expressed in policy, and some people's views are disproportionately I see this feedback, okay. And some people's views are disproportionately ignored in policy. So I think we need to turn it off. I just did. So like I said, there is a lot more common ground than people agree with, but I don't think that in itself is necessarily such cause for celebration. I don't want us to all rally around abstinence only. Like, the fact that the advocates of so-called comprehensive sex education have moved in that direction, like in the passage that I read, where abstinence is now proudly touted as at least one of the main goals, even by organizations like Planned Parenthood, that's just evidence of how far the whole game has moved to the right because of the extremely successful lobby of some social conservatives who have had the ear of politicians and a lot of very coordinated fundraising for 40 years. So even though the poll numbers show that that's not actually a majority view, it's become one of these like signature culture war issues on which political identity is hinged. And it's meant that, especially in light of the historical stuff that Lisa talks about, like HIV in the 80s and panic about young people's sexuality, the only way to keep sexuality education in schools for a long time was thought to be, from a more progressive or comprehensive standpoint, like retreat to the least controversial things possible. Retreat to plumbing, as they call it, like the biology, the facts, public health, like really non-negotiable things. Don't talk about gender, don't talk about feelings, don't talk about sexual attraction and sexual orientation, don't talk about consent, just retreat, and that is supposed to be like minimally offensive. And I think that's just, that's unfortunate, and like we're advocating for something much more expansive than that. But it's been a strategic response to the kind of disproportionate voice that the abstinence-only advocates have had, at least in US policy.
You write about how evidence-based policy can be controversial, and it seems kind of counterintuitive to me me, you know, because like research, we like research, right? So can you talk about why research is sometimes misleading, especially when it comes to abstinence-only education and what you call virginity pledges?
Yes. So yeah, of course, you know, we want to be pro-research and we want to be pro-evidence-based policy. There are limits to what evidence can tell us, but the limits aren't necessarily where everybody says they are. So part of what happens is that we enter into this era of more pronounced evidence-based policy, and we also have decades of evidence now that abstinence-only education fails by its own metrics. I mean, that's not liberals' metrics, like that's your own metrics, and it fails. So people have to get extremely creative about how they use evidence if they want to marshal evidence for their position. Part of what happens is that I think that liberals and advocates for comprehensive sex education look at the empirical data, like showing, like I said, you know, the mismatch between abstinence-only education and actual rates of sexual activity and actual rates of teen pregnancy, and just say, see, there you go, so change your mind. And of course, that's not really how people change their mind, especially when the political stakes are immense and when it also taps into these like deep-seated elements of our identity and our tribe and our community, as sex education tends to do. So we can point to evidence of a certain kind, which is sort of empirical outcomes, and say, okay, look, this doesn't add up. But there's a lot of other kinds of evidence that matter to people as well, and evidence can be, you know, used very selectively. So I think the point that you want me to get to about virginity pledges, aside from, oh my God, reading about that was a bit of a trip, but there's commonality among those who support abstinence-only education in schools and in religious communities and other places, and those who partake in virginity or purity culture. And purity can mean that teenage girls, for example, go through elaborate ceremonies where they promise to their father that they will save themselves for marriage, and they may put on a ring or do something symbolic, almost like a wedding ceremony, kind of like making contractual commitment to this. There is some evidence that people who participate in those ceremonies delay the onset of sexual activity. And that has been used by some organizations advocating for abstinence-only education as proof that abstinence only works, even though it's a different approach and not done through the school system. And you can think of other reasons why people who have gone through that kind of ritual and feel a whole bunch of obligation to their families and their communities may also change their behavior accordingly. Unfortunately, the people who do virginity pledges, although they may be later to have vaginal intercourse, are overrepresented among young people having other kinds of sex, and overrepresented among young people contracting sexually transmitted infections because they're not taught about safer sex. So the very selective use of evidence can be kind of deployed to make it seem like there's a genuine like scientific disagreement here when actually it's just about different values.
I want to get to questions, Q&A time soon, but I just want to get in a couple of quick things first. Lisa, historically, who has taught sex ed, since it's been different in different eras, and why is it gym teachers now?
Because the gym teachers don't want to do it. I mean, like, let's be clear about that. So the rationale for this is that it goes to the question of, should young men and young women be in the same room when they learn about puberty, right? Okay, so I would say, look, if in many cases, many of us are going to be involved with somebody who's of a different sex, and if that's going to be the case, you definitely need to know how the equipment works, right? Like that, so that's just there. Like, so maybe you should start having good communication between genders about difficult things, like let's learn how to do that, right? But the idea is, which classes are there if you thought it was really important to keep from each sex information about the other sex's genitals? I'm just gonna say it like really clearly, right? What are the classes where you can do that? Okay, so there's a big push initially to put sex education in home ec. I don't know how the boys were gonna learn it because shop seemed like a really bad connection, I'm gonna be honest. Okay, but home ec was one option. And then in gym classes, it largely went to gym class because those classes were already sex segregated, right? So the idea is if you thought it was really important to teach that in a separated environment, then that was the only place that it was at school. So, I mean, that actually goes to the question of why is sex ed in schools? And initially the answer to that was, well, because they're holding cells for children, right? Like if you want to get a message to children very largely, you go to where all the children are, and that's in schools. I think there's a lot of us who would be like, okay, I can think of better institutions than schools. You know, I mean, like there's and if you think about it, the measure of Americans' enthusiasm for sex ed, right, is the fact that we do it in churches, in medical clinics, in schools, in families. Like the truth is that we teach sex education all over the place. There's also this whole media thing that I've heard about. So we talk about sex like all the time. There's no reason why it has to be just contained in schools, and that's yet another way to measure Americans' enthusiasm. Because Lauren was talking about, like, we're talking about between 96 and 98% of Americans want sex education in schools. Like, it's not a challenging sort of thing. Like, this should be a slam dunk. Back to gym class. You know?
So one more before we turn to the audience. Research, we were talking about research, excuse me, also tells us that most teens cite porn as their most helpful source for learning about sex. The pornification of teen culture is everywhere. Girls are learning to sexualize themselves in selfies. At the same time, purity culture and slut shaming is also going strong. So we have these two contradictory kind of culture points, and boys are getting mixed messages too, to be good and to have sexual prowess. What do we do about this as parents?
I wish I could answer. I wish I could just give you the secret sauce right here. But yeah, this is a really important thing to talk about, and it's another example of, especially now, there's far more common ground among parents across the political spectrum than we give credit for. And you know, that idea that liberals or people who favor comprehensive sex education are amoral libertines. I mean, no parent wants their 10-year-old to watch pornography. No parent, and it's not because you're sexually repressed, it's because we all see that this can be damaging, misinformative, especially insofar as pornography is often violent and perpetuates stereotypes and on and on and on. So it's not like, oh, only, you know, the conservative parents are concerned about this whole Pornhub and smartphone thing. We're all super, super concerned about this. But I think there's been a major lag in average parents and people's willingness to talk about it. And studies also show that parents, again, across the political spectrum, are regularly underestimate what their kids have in fact been exposed to and what kids their age are in fact doing. It's not about what you believe is right or wrong. It's about this generation gulf that I think is much steeper than we've really acknowledged. Smartphones really did change everything. Of course, there was pornography before, but it truly is different now because you don't even have to go looking for it. So in terms of how we respond, I mean, one thing is we should find more common ground. This should be a less politicized issue, and we can stop using these really stigmatized ideas like childhood innocence or sexual promiscuity, and just talk about how, as adults responsible for children, we don't want kids to learn about sex this way, and we don't want them to get the message that sex is instrumental only and that they can behave in the ways that people in porn behave. So we need to get together and educate better. How we do that in the home varies, but like, don't be naive, I guess, is like the one piece of, but it's so tempting to just be naive, like, oh, I know other kids do that, but my kid doesn't do that. Or but I have a lot of parental controls on my kid's, smartphone. It doesn't work like that. We just have to get over it.
And Lauren often points to the statistic that typically for a child it's between 11 and 12. Like most 11 and 12-year-olds have seen porn.
Boys, anyway.
Boys, sorry. I don't know if they've done the research on girls. I don't know if they've done that.
Yeah, they have.
Did you see a stat on that?
Yeah, girls it's a little bit later, but that's important because boys think that that's what sex is, and they teach their girlfriends. They have consumed more porn than their girlfriends have, and it's actually reprising a very sexist and patriarchal version of sex education where girls feel like they're prude or they're ignorant if they don't go along with what their boyfriends who have consumed pornography tell them sex is supposed to be like.
Well, on that note, who has questions?
It's like, I have questions, I don't want them answered.
I'm afraid of the answer.
I guess I'd just be interested because I recently, and I don't know if it's anecdotal, if there's studies that the viewing of pornography went really up during COVID, particularly in young men, and that they're now not dating because it's a point of comparison when they actually have an interaction with someone. It pales so much in comparison to what they have seen, like their first experiences were. I don't know if you guys found anything out about that, but like what the reality of actually having an experience with a human versus these imaginary things. And so now kids had so much time on screen that it's really changing the way that first interactions are occurring and then the experiences thereafter.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to a large extent, like that's something that we're worried about, and part of it is we don't really know. I mean, for Lauren and I, like a lot of the statistics we use in here, we actually went back to pre-COVID statistics because we're like, since COVID came, like it was really difficult to do research, and it was such a changing circumstance that we're not exactly sure what that means. So there's been a little bit of work that's been done on it that has shown definitely transformations in what it means to date. Like, have you all had the conversation with your kids where you ask them what counts as dating? If you haven't done it, you totally should. It's hilarious, right? But like, we know that concepts like what counts as dating and even what counts as sex are in fact very cultural and that they change every generation. So it seems to me like that seems very likely to me and quite possible. And then it'll probably take a little while for us to come up with the data.
But yes, I have seen some numbers saying that like porn use went up during COVID and that young people's entry into, intimate relationships has been problematized. It was already problematic before COVID, but I think COVID exacerbated a lot of the effects of screens and isolation and the sort of artificial way that people are getting intimate with each other since smartphones. I don't know that it's so much that like if you watch porn the real thing doesn't stack up as much. I think it's more that there's so much
Fingers crossed.
yeah. I think there's a huge amount of awkwardness and self-consciousness. Like it's not good for boys to compare themselves to porn stars either. I think that and it's not good to assume that people enjoy things because actors in porn pretend that they enjoy them. And then not have the vocabulary and the openness with a partner to really figure that out in real life. What does this feel like to you? Or even what does this feel like to me? They've already been told a whole story about what things are supposed to look like, what things are supposed to feel like. So first of all, porn is not just bad for women. I think it's probably generally mainstream porn bad for everybody, especially if that's your first exposure, if that's what is setting the bar for you about what sex is. And I think research with young men all the way through college and later still shows they're incredibly insecure, and it's like what you were saying, Hillary, like they've been through Me Too, they've been through a kind of feminist reckoning, they know about toxic masculinity, they don't want to be jerks, but they're also in this porn-saturated culture and like starved of a lot of meaningful human interaction and have to learn about things over screens. So it's very hard to figure out how to behave under those circumstances. And it's not good for anybody.
Other questions?
So how do we prevent the kids from looking at porn?
I think, so the question is, how do you stop them from looking at porn? And that ship has way sailed, like way sailed.
What do you do?
What you do is you actually talk about it. Okay, so like one of the most common questions for young men in sex education classrooms, because they still do the question box thing where you can put a
They
non-question.
don't. Not in our school.
Oh yeah, not at our school. Okay, never mind about that. Okay, but that's still
At
one of
other
the most-
schools they do.
At other schools they do it. It's traditional. And I have like friends who do sex education professionally, and they track what questions, right, are coming up at different times, right? And one of the most common ones is like, how do I know if my genitals are normal, right? If what you're doing is you're getting your information for pornography, wait just a minute, okay, and like think for a second about what men look like in pornographies and their genitals. Can you imagine what that would do to most young men, right? Like that's gonna be devastating, right? They don't know if they're normal. And so like the way you get ahead of it is you just be like, by the way, I changed your diapers for several years, you're fine, right? So what it is you answer the question before the question gets asked. So if you think about, okay, let's work with the assumption that young people are intentionally or accidentally like having porn, right, as part of their lives, it pops up on their YouTube or whatever it is, right? Then what are the things that if you assume that's happening, you want to get ahead of, right? Like, so it's just like, and it can be very mundane and very fast. So it's like, really quickly, by the way, most people don't choke each other. Okay, moving on. You know, you just kind of like go with it and just set that sense of, because I think what our young family life often does is it tells us like, okay, what do I want my child to think of as healthy and typical, right? We all are values givers as parents. There's nobody who's a parent who's just like, you be you, or like very few of them. So it's just getting ahead before they get to the porn.
There's an organization called the Porn Conversation that gives a lot of information if people are interested in that. Emily.
If it's okay, I wanted to add to that, and I'm a hypocrite because it doesn't work for me with my kids, but I know other people for whom it works. So, which is, if your kid is a reader and there's a novel that represents healthy consensual sex between young people, I give them the book. And by the same token, there's a lot of Netflix and other streaming series that have there's a lot of sex in all of them, and some of them actually do a really good job at portraying meaningful conversations and interactions between characters. And so I just when my kids were young enough that they weren't embarrassed and mortified, we would watch them then and then talk about them just to like lay the groundwork.
I'm a big fan of pausing, right? I mean, and I do it with like anything that we're watching. So like we have a rule in our household, and everybody's household is different. Like in our household, we have the rule that you can watch and listen to whatever you want if we're there. And I'm like, it's fine. I'm just gonna sit here and I'm gonna pause and we're gonna talk about it. And it's one of those things where it probably takes some of the fun out of it for them. I'm okay with that, And it does prompt a lot. I mean, like, when my kids was binge watching Friends, like during COVID, you'd be amazed what comes up in Friends. God bless, the recently departed. And it's really easy. You just stop it and you're like, what do you think happened when they went back in that room? Okay, you got it? Okay, that's all I need. Go ahead. You just go with it.
My 9-year-old daughter is really into pop music, and she doesn't understand most of the lyrics. So sometimes I stop and say, what was that lyric? And she's like, I don't know, I think they said such and such and such. Oh, do you know what that means? Can I tell you what it means? You're going to tell me anyway, aren't you? Yes, I am.
So before I disclose what I'm going to disclose, I just want to peek and see if my son's girlfriend's mother I feel so inadequate when it comes to this. Lisa, you know this very well. That I think in my mind, oh, this conversation is going to go so fine because I know what I know and I know what I want my son to know. And then I go to talk about it, and my son actually said to me, you are terrible at this. I know, but could you just make it a little easier on me and just listen? But somebody, like, I really appreciated what you said about just going to the end goal, which is understanding what you want, which is for them to feel healthy and natural. Is that what you said? Something like that. Somebody else said, don't ask questions because that makes them feel put on the spot, right? You're just there to inform. That was also very helpful. And of course the car, the best location to do it. So those are, but I'm telling you, I feel like I'm back in my bedroom as a 13-year-old when I start to talk about it, because we're so deeply, like those elements of shame and of abstinence, because we grew up, somewhat, unless I'm sure you're more progressive. And just like those in the religion part of it, it's just so complex.
But see, I mean, you can see what Heather's doing, right? Which is that as she's talking about this, she's turning into a 13-year-old girl. world and let yourself be in that place, right? Like, I mean that in like the most complimentary way possible. Like, because really what you want to convey to your child is like, when two of you are in a vulnerable position, which is what sexuality is. When you are with somebody else in a vulnerable position, how do you listen to them, right? How do you tell them this is not going well? How do you tell them this is what I want to know or this is what I want, right? And those lessons that we do raising our children really set them up. Like, you know, right from the beginning, like rules like respecting that people should decide how they get to touch and be touched, and respecting that you're allowed to change your mind, right? Those are rules that we start with children at age 4, right? And that's sex ed. So whether you know it or not, you've been doing sex ed since your kids were like 3, right? The skills that you teach them when you're not talking about sex, right, are in fact really good scaffolding skills that they really needed. So it'll be okay. I mean, also, I will tell you, I'm a big fan of the ambush, yell, and leave the room, right? Like, so.
Could you give an example?
I'm going to, God help me. God knows what to do. So, like, we have a family policy that, like, whenever we start talking about sexuality on the internet, either Matt or I will yell, "And this is why you should never take a picture of your penis." Like, literally, and then we just end the conversation. Which, frankly, I think is as much for our amusement as theirs, but I'll be darned if that rule, like, and then, of course, there's the thing where, like, well, but maybe if you're, like, over 20 and in a committed relationship, you know, maybe it's okay then. We don't really know. We're like, but definitely not now.
Anything else?
Well, I just want to put in a plug if anybody has like upcoming 8th graders, or in 8th grade there's a Unitarian church in town that offers a really great comprehensive sex education program. Like, you don't have to be Unitarian. It's like a really wonderful, I feel like it's it's such a gift to give to your children. Like, it talks about consent, it talks about healthy relationships, it's just a really great program. So if anybody is
I would actually second that, like,
Yeah.
having seen the curriculum and how the curriculum evolved over time. They have a secular and a religious version, right? And it's the only one with really clear pictures, okay? Like, just to be really blunt. Because at a certain point, like, I am not a fan of children learning about sex through porn, but an illustration that is not exploitative of anyone sometimes can explain things really clearly. Okay, I'm going to say this anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so I needed to find a picture of a vagina, right, that wasn't artificially enhanced or pruned, okay? Like, in order to show what it looks like so that we can have a conversation. Do you know how hard it is to find an illustration of a vagina online that, like, that is not sketchy? Teen Vogue.
There's a website called The Great Wall of Vagina. It is.
Might as well share the resource.
It is actual, unfiltered pictures given by consenting people of their vaginas, showing the incredible and beautiful diversity of actual vaginas. And it really is a powerful antidote to porn culture and just very normative beauty and body culture in general.
There's also a book called You Know Sex, which is illustrated. That's very comprehensive in many ways. I recommend that highly.